The dust clouds kicked up by the afternoon. Stagecoach settled slowly over the main street of Copper Ridge, a town that had seen better days, but still held onto its stubborn pride like a gambler clutching his last silver dollar. Samuel Harrison stood on the wooden porch of his ranch house. 3 miles outside town, his calloused hands gripping the telegram that had arrived 2 days prior. The paper was already worn from his repeated readings, each word memorized yet still capable of sending his heart racing with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. At 32, Samuel had built his ranch from nothing more than determination and backbreaking work. The Lazy H spread across 500 acres of prime Colorado territory, with grazing land that made other ranches green with envy and a water source that never ran dry, even in the harshest summers. Yet for all his material success, Samuel's evenings were spent in solitude, eating meals prepared by his own inexperienced hands and talking only to his horses and cattle. The loneliness had become a constant companion, as familiar and unwelcome as the ache in his back after a long day of fence mending. The decision to seek a mail-order bride had not come easily. Samuel was a proud man, raised by a father who believed that real men solved their own problems without asking for help from anyone. But as winter after winter passed, with only the howling wind for conversation, Samuel had finally swallowed his pride and placed an advertisement in a Boston newspaper, seeking a refined lady who might be willing to share the challenges and rewards of frontier life. What Samuel didn't know, as he stood watching the horizon for signs of the approaching stagecoach, was that his carefully worded telegram had been intercepted, altered, and replaced by the Caldwell brothers, Marcus and Theodore, the most vindictive and petty men in 3 counties. These brothers had harbored a burning resentment against Samuel ever since he'd outbid them for the prime grazing land along Willow Creek, land that had been in their family's sights for over a decade. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. The Caldwell brothers were not content with simple business competition. They viewed Samuel's success as a personal affront, a reminder of their own failures and missed opportunities. Marcus, the elder brother, had inherited his father's ranch, but had run it into near bankruptcy through poor decisions and excessive drinking. Theodore, younger by 3 years, but equally bitter, had tried his hand at everything from mining to gambling, failing spectacularly at each venture while watching Samuel's steady rise to prosperity. Their plan had been months in the making, requiring careful coordination and no small amount of bribery. They discovered Samuel's correspondence with the marriage broker through a clerk at the telegraph office who owed Theodore money from a poker game gone wrong. Instead of the refined Miss Elizabeth Hartwell of Boston, a woman of education and social standing who had been corresponding with Samuel for nearly 6 months, they'd arranged for someone entirely different to arrive bearing the same name and credentials. The stagecoach pulled up to the general store with its usual fanfare of creaking leather, snorting horses, and the driver's colorful commentary about the condition of the roads. Half the town had gathered to witness what they believed would be Samuel Harrison's moment of triumph, the arrival of his sophisticated Eastern bride. The Caldwell brothers had spread word throughout Copper Ridge that something highly entertaining was about to unfold, and in a town where the most exciting event of the week was usually the arrival of the mail, folks didn't need much encouragement to gather for what promised to be memorable entertainment. The crowd included Martha Henley, the postmaster's wife, and the town's most reliable source of gossip, Doc Patterson, who claimed he was there for medical reasons, but was clearly as curious as everyone else, and even old Pete Morrison, who rarely left his cabin except for supplies and whiskey. The anticipation was palpable as the stagecoach driver climbed down from his perch and began untying the luggage from the roof. When the coach door finally opened with its characteristic squeal of hinges that needed oiling, outstepped a woman who immediately drew stares, gasps, and whispered comments from every person in the gathered crowd. This was clearly not what anyone had expected, least of all Samuel, who had ridden into town specifically to escort his bride back to the ranch with all the ceremony and respect she deserved. Margaret O'Sullivan was nothing like the delicate Boston socialite described in the letters Samuel had treasured and read countless times by lamplight. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver despite her 28 years, was pulled back in a practical bun secured with simple wooden pins rather than the elaborate combs and ribbons favored by fashionable ladies. Her dress was sturdy brown wool, well made but clearly designed for utility rather than style, and her hands, visible as she gathered her simple carpet bag and a small wooden trunk, showed the unmistakable calluses and slight staining that came from years of honest physical work. Yet there was something about Margaret O'Sullivan that commanded respect even from those who had come expecting to witness a spectacle. She carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the obvious whispers and pointed fingers from the crowd. Her green eyes, the color of spring grass after rain, held intelligence and determination, and when she looked around at the assembled townspeople, she neither cowered nor challenged, but simply acknowledged their presence with a slight nod that suggested she was accustomed to being the subject of scrutiny and judgment. Samuel approached slowly, his heart sinking with each step as he realized that something had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the photograph he'd received and kept in his vest pocket, a formal portrait of a pale, delicate-featured woman in an elaborate dress with perfectly arranged blonde curls. Yet this woman held the same papers, bore the same name, and had arrived on the exact day and time specified in their correspondence. Margaret's green eyes met his with a mixture of hope, apprehension, and something else, a kind of resigned courage that suggested she'd faced disappointment before and survived it. In that moment of mutual recognition and confusion, both realized they'd been caught in someone else's cruel game, though neither yet understood the full scope of the deception that had brought them together. The Caldwell brothers watched from their position across the street, leaning against the hitching post outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, barely containing their laughter as they anticipated Samuel's public rejection of this unexpected bride. They'd paid handsomely, nearly $200, a fortune by their standards, to ensure that the wrong woman arrived in Copper Ridge, expecting Samuel to either humiliate her publicly by refusing to honor his commitment or be trapped in a marriage that would make him the laughingstock of the entire territory. Their plan had been elegantly simple in its cruelty. They'd bribed the marriage broker in Denver to substitute Margaret for Elizabeth at the last moment, providing her with Elizabeth's papers and instructions to present herself as the Boston socialite. They'd counted on Samuel's pride and the public nature of the bride's arrival to force him into an impossible situation, either break his word in front of the entire town or accept a wife who was clearly beneath his social aspirations. What the Caldwell brothers hadn't counted on was the quiet strength that both Samuel and Margaret possessed, nor the way adversity sometimes reveals the true character of people's hearts rather than destroying them. They'd assumed that Samuel was as shallow and status-conscious as they were, that he'd be so mortified by the substitution that he'd either send Margaret away in disgrace or spend years resenting her presence in his life. As the crowd began to disperse, disappointed that no immediate drama had unfolded, Samuel made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that his father had taught him to show to all ladies, regardless of their station, and offered Margaret his arm with the same courtesy he would have shown to the governor's wife. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "I believe we have much to discuss, and I suspect we'll both have questions that need answering." Would you do me the honor of allowing me to escort you to my ranch, where we can speak privately about our situation?" The dignity with which Samuel handled this unexpected turn of events, and the grateful relief that flickered across Margaret's face at his courteous response, marked the beginning of something that neither had expected when they'd first agreed to this arrangement. The crowd, denied the spectacle they'd anticipated, began to drift away with disappointed murmurs, though Martha Henley made mental notes of every detail to share with her network of correspondents throughout the territory. The ride to Samuel's ranch passed in contemplative silence, both passengers lost in thoughts about how their carefully laid plans had been so thoroughly disrupted. Margaret clutched her small carpet-bag, wondering if she should confess the truth about her circumstances immediately or wait to see how this strange situation would unfold. Samuel wrestled with questions about honor, duty, and the strange twist of fate that had brought this woman into his life instead of the refined lady he'd been expecting and, if he was honest with himself, somewhat dreading. The Lazy H ranch house came into view as they crested the final hill, and Margaret couldn't suppress a small gasp of appreciation. The building was larger and more substantial than she'd expected, built from local timber and stone, with obvious care and attention to detail. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, offering shade in summer and protection from winter winds. The barn and outbuildings were equally well maintained, and the entire property spoke of prosperity achieved through hard work rather than inherited wealth. Samuel noticed her reaction and felt a small surge of pride despite the awkwardness of their situation. "I built most of it myself," he said quietly, "with help from neighbors during barn-raising season. It's not fancy, but it's solid and comfortable. The well never runs dry, and the house stays warm, even in the worst blizzards." Margaret nodded, impressed despite herself. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "You can see the care that went into every board and stone. A house like this represents years of planning and work." Her appreciation seemed genuine, and Samuel found himself relaxing slightly. Whatever deception had brought them together, this woman clearly understood the value of honest labor and careful craftsmanship. That was more than he could say for some of the supposedly refined ladies he'd encountered in Denver on his rare trips to the city. The following weeks brought revelations that neither Samuel nor Margaret could have anticipated. As they worked side by side to maintain the ranch, she insisting on earning her keep regardless of their unusual circumstances, they began to uncover the layers of deception that had brought them together. The work itself provided a natural framework for conversation, allowing them to share their stories without the artificial pressure of formal courtship. Margaret revealed her true background gradually, testing Samuel's reactions as she shared each piece of her history. She'd been born in County Cork, Ireland, but had come to America as a child when the potato famine drove her family from their homeland. They'd settled in a small Irish community in Pennsylvania, where her father had found work in the coal mines, and her mother had taken in washing to supplement their meager income. Education had been Margaret's escape from the grinding poverty that claimed so many immigrant families. The local Catholic Church had sponsored a small school run by Irish nuns, and Margaret had proven to be an exceptional student with a particular gift for mathematics and languages. She'd learned to read and write in both English and Gaelic, and had even picked up some German from the families who lived nearby. When her parents died within 6 months of each other, her father from lung disease caused by years in the mines, her mother from exhaustion and heartbreak, Margaret had found herself responsible for 3 younger siblings. She'd worked as a seamstress, a shop clerk, and even briefly as a teacher in the church school, but the wages were never enough to provide the kind of life she wanted for her brothers and sister. The marriage broker's advertisement had seemed like a miracle when it appeared in the Philadelphia newspaper. A respectable rancher in Colorado Territory was seeking a wife, offering security, a comfortable home, and the promise of a better life than anything Margaret could provide for herself in Pennsylvania. She'd answered immediately, pouring her heart into letters that described her dreams, her values, and her willingness to work hard for a shared future. What Margaret didn't initially tell Samuel was that she'd been instructed by the marriage broker to use a different name and background. The broker, a man named Cornelius Wickham, who operated out of a shabby office in Denver, had told her that her Irish heritage and working-class background might be off-putting to potential husbands. He'd provided her with Elizabeth Hartwell's identity and background, coaching her on the details of Boston society and upper-class mannerisms. Margaret had been uncomfortable with the deception from the beginning, but her desperation to escape poverty and provide for her siblings had overridden her moral qualms. She'd practiced Elizabeth's refined accent, memorized details about Boston landmarks she'd never seen, and even learned to walk and sit in the constrained manner expected of a lady of breeding. Samuel's own investigation into their circumstances revealed information that was equally disturbing. A conversation with the telegraph operator, prompted by his suspicion that something wasn't right about the timing and content of the messages he'd received, uncovered the Caldwell brothers' involvement in the deception. The operator, a nervous man named Jenkins, who had a weakness for whiskey and gambling, eventually confessed that Theodore Caldwell had paid him to intercept and alter Samuel's correspondence. The original messages from Elizabeth Hartwell had been destroyed, replaced with communications that led Samuel to expect her arrival on a specific date, while actually arranging for Margaret to be sent in her place. Jenkins also revealed that the Caldwell brothers had been spreading rumors throughout the territory about Samuel's impending humiliation, taking bets on whether he'd send his unsuitable bride away immediately or be trapped in a marriage that would destroy his social standing. They'd invested considerable time and money in their scheme, viewing it as both revenge for their business losses and entertainment for the long winter months. Armed with this information, Samuel felt his anger building not at Margaret, who was clearly as much a victim of the deception as he was, but at the men who had manipulated both of their lives for their own petty satisfaction. The realization that Margaret had been used as a pawn in someone else's game of revenge made him protective of her in a way that surprised him with its intensity. As autumn painted the Colorado landscape in brilliant colors of gold, orange, and deep red, Samuel and Margaret discovered that their forced partnership was evolving into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. The practical necessities of ranch life had thrown them together in ways that normal courtship never would have allowed, giving them insights into each other's character that might have taken months or years to develop under conventional circumstances. Margaret's skills proved invaluable in ways that went far beyond the domestic duties typically expected of a ranch wife. She could mend anything from torn clothing to broken harness leather, using techniques learned from her mother and refined through years of necessity. Her mathematical abilities made her a natural bookkeeper, and she quickly identified several areas where the ranch's efficiency could be improved through better organization and planning. More importantly, Margaret brought a perspective to ranch management that Samuel had never considered. Having grown up in poverty, she understood the value of every resource and could find uses for things that Samuel might have discarded. She established a kitchen garden that provided fresh vegetables well into the fall, preserved foods for winter storage, and even began raising chickens for eggs and meat. Samuel, in turn, showed Margaret a kindness and respect that she'd rarely experienced in her difficult life. He never made her feel ashamed of her humble background or her work-roughened hands. Instead, he seemed to value her practical knowledge and her willingness to contribute to their shared goals. When she made suggestions about ranch operations, he listened carefully and often implemented her ideas, giving her credit for improvements that increased both their efficiency and their profits. The turning point in their relationship came during a fierce October blizzard that trapped them in the ranch house for nearly a week. The storm struck with little warning, bringing howling winds and snow that fell so heavily it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Samuel had barely managed to get the livestock into the barn and secure the outbuildings before the worst of the weather hit. With nothing but each other's company and the crackling fire for comfort, they finally spoke openly about their fears, their dreams, and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. The enforced intimacy of their situation, sharing meals, tending the fire, and spending long hours in conversation, broke down the careful politeness they'd maintained since Margaret's arrival. Margaret confessed that she'd fallen in love with Samuel through his letters, even before she'd met him, and that her greatest fear was that he'd discover she wasn't worthy of the affection he'd shown to the woman he thought he was marrying. She'd been terrified that her deception would be discovered and that she'd be sent away in disgrace, leaving her with no way to support herself or help her siblings. Samuel's response surprised them both with its honesty and emotional depth. He told her that the woman described in those letters, refined, delicate, and completely unfamiliar with ranch life, would have been miserable in his world, and he would have been constantly worried about her happiness and well-being. Margaret, with her strength, her practical nature, and her genuine warmth, was everything he'd actually needed, even if he hadn't been wise enough to know it when he'd first placed his advertisement for a bride. During those snow-bound days, they shared stories from their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and their fears about the challenges they might face together. Samuel told Margaret about his parents, who had died in a wagon accident when he was 22, leaving him to build the ranch alone. He spoke of the loneliness that had driven him to seek a mail-order bride, and his worry that he'd forgotten how to be a proper companion to a woman after so many years of solitude. Margaret shared the pain of losing her parents and the weight of responsibility she'd carried for her siblings. She described the grinding poverty of her childhood, but also the moments of joy and love that had sustained her family through their darkest times. She spoke of her dreams of education and advancement, and her hope that marriage might provide not just security, but the chance to build something meaningful with a partner who shared her values. By the time the storm cleared and they could venture outside again, both Samuel and Margaret knew that their relationship had fundamentally changed. What had begun as an arrangement born of deception and manipulation had evolved into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and growing affection. The revelation that changed everything came in early spring when a letter arrived from the real Elizabeth Hartwell. The envelope was addressed to Samuel in an elegant hand that he recognized from their original correspondence, and the return address confirmed that it came from Boston. Margaret watched nervously as Samuel opened the letter, fearing that it might contain demands or accusations that would destroy the fragile happiness they'd built together. Instead, Elizabeth's letter contained an apology and an explanation that vindicated both Samuel and Margaret while exposing the full scope of the Caldwell brothers' deception. Elizabeth wrote that she'd discovered the marriage broker's fraudulent practices through a friend whose own mail-order marriage had been similarly manipulated. She'd learned that Cornelius Wickham was operating an elaborate scheme, taking money from multiple parties to arrange marriages that served his financial interests rather than the happiness of his clients. Elizabeth explained that she'd withdrawn from her arrangement with Samuel after meeting and falling in love with a banker in Boston, but that Wickham had continued to collect fees from both parties while arranging for Margaret to take her place. The Caldwell brothers had paid Wickham handsomely to ensure that Samuel received an unsuitable bride, hoping to cause him embarrassment and social damage. Most importantly, Elizabeth's letter contained evidence of the conspiracy, copies of telegrams and financial records that proved the Caldwell brothers' involvement in the scheme. She'd felt compelled to write and warn Samuel about the conspiracy, not knowing that their cruel scheme had actually resulted in a love match that neither Samuel nor Margaret could have imagined when they'd first entered into their respective arrangements. Armed with this proof of the Caldwell brothers' interference, Samuel rode into town with a determination and anger that surprised even himself. He'd always been a peaceful man, preferring to solve problems through negotiation rather than confrontation, but the knowledge that Marcus and Theodore had deliberately manipulated his life and Margaret's for their own entertainment filled him with a righteous fury that demanded satisfaction. Samuel confronted the Caldwell brothers publicly, not with violence, as they might have expected, but with the truth about their failed scheme and its unintended consequences. He chose the busiest time of day, when the general store was crowded with ranchers and townspeople conducting their weekly business, to read Elizabeth Hartwell's letter aloud and present the evidence of their conspiracy. The entire town learned how the Caldwell brothers' attempt to humiliate Samuel had backfired spectacularly, resulting in a marriage built on genuine affection and mutual respect, rather than the superficial attraction or social advancement they'd assumed he'd wanted. Samuel spoke eloquently about Margaret's character, her contributions to the ranch, and the happiness she'd brought to his life, making it clear that he considered himself the luckiest man in Colorado territory. The Caldwell brothers found themselves the objects of ridicule and contempt instead of Samuel, as the community realized how petty and vindictive their actions had been. Their reputation in Copper Ridge never recovered from the revelation of their interference in Samuel's personal affairs. Within 6 months, they'd lost several important business contracts as other ranchers refused to deal with men who would stoop to such underhanded tactics. The social ostracism that followed was more devastating to the Caldwell brothers than any physical punishment could have been. In a community where a man's word was his bond and reputation meant everything, they found themselves excluded from business deals, social gatherings, and even casual conversations. Within a year, they'd sold their remaining holdings at a significant loss and moved on to try their luck elsewhere, leaving Samuel and Margaret to build their life together without the shadow of their malice hanging over them. Margaret's transformation from reluctant mail-order bride to beloved wife and respected member of the community became a source of inspiration for other women who'd felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Her intelligence and education, combined with her practical skills and genuine warmth, made her a natural leader among the ranch wives and town women. She started a small school for the children of local ranchers and farmers, using the education she'd received from the Irish nuns in Pennsylvania to give the next generation opportunities she'd never had herself. The school met in the church during winter months and outdoors during pleasant weather, and Margaret taught everything from basic reading and arithmetic to geography and history. Samuel's ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout the territory for its well-maintained buildings, healthy livestock, and the warm hospitality offered to travelers. The couple's reputation for fairness and generosity attracted good workers and loyal friends, creating the kind of community Samuel had always dreamed of, but never thought he'd be able to build on his own. Their success was built on more than just hard work and good management. Samuel and Margaret had learned to combine their different strengths and perspectives in ways that made them more effective together than either could have been alone. Samuel's knowledge of ranching and local conditions, combined with Margaret's organizational skills and financial acumen, created a partnership that other couples in the territory began to emulate. The final vindication of their unlikely love story came 5 years later, when Elizabeth Hartwell herself visited Copper Ridge with her own husband, a successful banker from Boston whom she'd married shortly after withdrawing from her arrangement with Samuel. Elizabeth had written to ask if she might visit during a trip west to see the Colorado territory, and both Samuel and Margaret had eagerly agreed to meet the woman whose identity had played such a crucial role in bringing them together. Elizabeth spent an afternoon with Samuel and Margaret, marveling at how perfectly suited they were to each other, and how completely they'd built a life that neither could have achieved alone. She was particularly impressed by the school Margaret had established and the respect both Samuel and Margaret commanded throughout the community. As Elizabeth prepared to leave, she told Margaret something that brought tears to both women's eyes. "I've often wondered if fate didn't arrange for me to step aside so that you two could find each other. I could never have been the partner Samuel needed, and he could never have given me the life I wanted in Boston society. But watching you together, I can see that sometimes the wrong choice turns out to be exactly the right one." The story of Samuel and Margaret Harrison became legend in Copper Ridge, passed down through generations as proof that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances and overcome the most deliberate obstacles. Their marriage, born from deception and intended as humiliation, became instead a testament to the power of two honest hearts to find truth and happiness even in the midst of others' cruelty and manipulation. Years later, when visitors asked about the secret to their obviously happy marriage, Samuel would always smile and say, "Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst. We thought we were getting everything wrong, but it turned out we were getting everything exactly right," Margaret would add. With the gentle humor that had won his heart from the beginning, the Caldwell brothers thought they were playing a cruel joke on us, but they actually gave us the greatest gift imaginable. They gave us each other. Their love story proved that genuine affection, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the willingness to work together toward common goals, could overcome any obstacle, even one deliberately placed in their path by those who wished them harm. In the end, the wrong bride had indeed been the right choice all along, and their marriage became a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever felt that circumstances beyond their control had ruined their chances for happiness and fulfillment.